first thing I wanted to do this morning was see if anybody felt like they wanted to ask any questions or share any thoughts about what took place in France, in Paris. Just give some room for people to talk or ask questions or lament. Obviously, for me, um, you know, heinous acts of violence um, are discouraging, disheartening. Um, but in some ways, I almost found it just as disheartening to read people's hate-fueled language that followed the events, um, and to hear the rhetoric of anti-Islam, and to hear the rhetoric of us and them, and judgment and finger wagging that was based in fear mongering. Um, that to me was also really hard to read. To read people that I care about and stuff participating and joining into that language was hard. Um, and I understand that when something like this happens, we speak from very emotional places, as we should, and we should be given space and safety to do so. I hope that as we put a little bit of time between ourselves and that moment, or those moments, that peace, mercy, justice will be the language, particularly of the faithful, and not ones of fear mongering, finger wagging, and hatred. So kind of my thoughts. Anybody have any thoughts? Or
it reminds me of that, like the local event that happened with the news deal. It's a similar kind of emotion. It's like, obviously that's not a good thing, but how do you respond or react, like to any kind of a, whether it's like a hate crime or whatever it is, what's the appropriate biblical way to think about it even?
Yeah.
Because there's all the emotions, but then how do you process it appropriately according to like right thinking? Because it's frustrating when everybody gets really opinionated and squirrely, so it becomes a, for this topic it's usually not as intense from my experience, but like anything like that, whenever something happens, people get very outspoken. It's like, what do you do? And
yeah,
how do you do something? And because it's like, like in my head, I'm like, I don't have anything I can really help with that.
yeah,
But it'd be nice to respond to something, or it's confusing. So,
yeah,
and like processing, like I think we talked about this in my opinion that one day, like the motivation behind that. Like, what is that kind of thing come from? So it doesn't seem like a natural response to anything. So it's cool you brought it up. In my opinion, it's like it becomes possible to learn about some aspect of it.
Agreed. Anybody else?
It might be, when things like that happen, I always tend to think about how we ourselves became involved on the opposite end of that by our attempt to take over the Middle East. And of course, we entered into Iraq when we shouldn't have. But we had a vested interest in doing that. And then when we started using drones to go in and kill people, that has its repercussions. So part of the radicalism of the other side, you might say, is a response to our lack of thought, lack of consideration.
Yeah, I think there's so many things even beyond, some of these horrific events that we behave that very similarly, whether it be, we cry out against things as we should, such as slavery and human trafficking and stuff like that. But then we don't think about how we participate by the things that we consume, or the places that we consume from. And so we miss our contributions to it. And I think that can be very overwhelming. And I think that's probably why we avoid some of that, is because that's hard work and that's emotional and that's heavy. But I also think it would do us quite a bit of good if we became a people that were reflective of how we contributed, how we participated, how this moment didn't arise out of a vacuum of innocence, but instead. Yeah. Thank you.
So I'm thinking of like giving water to a village who's used to not having it. I would have never thought of like where that come from. We hadn't talked about that a long time ago.
Like asking, did the village intentionally build their village away from a water source?
Yeah, and like thinking if you give them water, of course it'll help. But I never thought of that until you mentioned like what would happen if all of a sudden a whole bunch more people, which is not like a right or a wrong. It's just thinking of that side of it, which is like, you know, the intentions. I hope most of the time is good. Just
It's hard to see beyond the present moment. I
Yeah.
mean, it's impossible to see beyond the present moment. But you know, definitely things that we do that put dominoes into motion, so to speak, that will continue far beyond us closing our eyes. You know, decisions that Dust Covenant Church makes today, even if for some reason Dust Covenant doesn't last forever. That would be shocking, right? But the impact of this community already is going to affect the future, and we're a small community. So if we think about that, how everything is impacted by our present moment decisions, how valuable and beautiful it can be that we can participate in creating a world that brings life and justice and mercy, or we can participate in creating a world that brings about death and destruction. Yeah, keep walking, pal. It's our entire youth ministry. Right? It's my son. So, anybody else have any thoughts they want to share about this, or laments, or anger, even? No emotions, off limits.
I was surprised at the responses that I saw on my social media sites. They were more compassionate than what you had described on yours. I saw that almost as positive. It's almost as if, at least my group of friends seems to be distinguishing between tribalism and people that are trying to do the right things.
Yeah.
So I saw that as a positive, a much more supportive environment, more accepting of.
Yeah. I think this time, in my feed, I saw a lot more healthy balance and even pushback. The problem was I made the mistake of, they always say don't scroll down. So I made the mistake of reading comments, and that's always a mistake, because when you can say whatever you want anonymously or under a pseudonym, you can say some crazy ass stuff, and there is a lot of that being said. So I think as far as like on the surface of my feeds, I think you're right. I also thought there was a lot of beautiful sentiment. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that yours was healthy.
I didn't scroll down.
Well, no one will be surprised by your wisdom over mine.
Oh, sorry, that's my stomach. I gotta get some water.
All right. Anybody else have any other thoughts about this? Obviously, do you have some, Zach?
Yeah. In the past, probably a few years, whenever I would see something, tragedy of any magnitude, or any kind of shift in the atmosphere, so to speak, occur, my first inclination would be to go right to social media and gripe on one side of the story or another. But I intentionally didn't even go on social media. I haven't been on it since Friday. So perhaps personally that is the most appropriate coping mechanism as far as personal healing and gathering thoughts and trying to be renewed by my, in
Yeah.
mind. It's evidence that this is a very broken world, broken people. We can't just focus on our own brokenness, but acknowledge that it's everywhere, with every single person who's ever lived, except for one. But it's in that acknowledgement of that we are all broken and that we all need a healer. If we can just get to the point where we, by whatever means, healthy means necessary, if we can agree to seek healing instead of wagging fingers and, all that.
Yeah. Yep.
In many ways, I'm, don't get me wrong, I'm definitely, my heart goes out to the victims and their families of the tragedy in Beirut as well as Paris. However, especially looking back to 9/11 a number of years ago, and then just tracing it all the way back to, or all the way forward to the present moment, it's not something that we're completely foreign to. And unfortunately, it very well could happen again on our shores. I don't want to speak that over our country by any means. I think that would be tragic. But I definitely believe that as believers, we need to prepare ourselves spiritually.
But I would like to say that we should be aware that as a member of the faithful, whenever a tragedy happens like this, it's our shores. This isn't that this happened in France and not in the US. This happened to people who I believe very deeply are in the image of God, and somebody decided to play God in some way, and I don't think that this. I think we need to be always weary. Paul uses language over the body. And I've often thought about the idea that when I stub my toe in the middle of the night, I voluntarily or involuntarily curse about it because the reaction is felt all throughout my body. And I think something that the church has done that's a great tragedy is that we have lost the ability to feel a stubbed toe. We no longer, the whole body doesn't respond in pain from one part of the body being hurt. And I think that as members of the faithful, we should feel the pain of this in very real ways, not in a distant, detached way. The difficult part is we've all been taught to be detached. We've all been demonstrated that it's, my individual faith, my individual this, my individual that, as opposed to this corporateness that's completely and totally defined over and over in the text. And so in telling us that, when something tragic happens or something, even a blessing happens somewhere else, we're detached from it. We don't feel the pain from it, nor do we celebrate the blessing that happens somewhere else. We tend to immediately think, why doesn't that ever happen to me?
It really gives flesh to this teaching of, literally rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn those who mourn.
And we need to be better at that. But I think that's something we need to learn because we've for so long have had gangrene for so long and have been disassociated with the rest of our body. And we're too busy pointing out that the toe isn't a hand, or finding reasons to have disunity rather than recognize our interconnectedness, which is complicated and not easy. And this goes back to what we said earlier. We tend to go the easy route on everything, right? As opposed to the hard work that goes into unity. So. All right. Any other questions or thoughts, laments? Thank you for everyone who shared. Appreciate that. It's always tough to share sometimes in this setting. So. All right, let's talk about something way easier now. Sex. Right? Lucky you. First day you're here, we're gonna talk about. Yeah, that part I'm not explaining. See,
Malcolm just had family life stuff this week, though, so you can ask him.
yeah, you can. Yeah, this isn't about family life. I actually have something that to me is so deeply disconcerting to me. And that's what I want to talk about today. How many of you, and if your answer is not me, I bless God for that, because I would hope that it's not you, have been taught to feel any kind of guilt, shame, or blame when it comes to anything that has to do with sex and your faith? Yeah. So I got a lot of nods and a couple hand raises. I have had that talk to me. I want to make the case that sex, sensuality, that is not actually something that should be carried around with guilt and blame and suffering. That's something that the church has created. I don't want to speak to its motives. I have opinions as to what the motivations are for that. But anybody, and I get that this topic is one of those ones where we don't like to talk about it, and so therefore the church obliges and just never talks about it. Or when they do, we make a big billboard and show 2 pairs of bare feet sticking out from underneath the blanket, and they're like, we're going to talk about sex. And they're really not. They're going to tell you to live in a heteronormative society and everyone should get married. That's what they're going to tell you. They're actually not going to talk to you about sex, sensuality, and love in that manner, intimacy, physical intimacy, which frustrates me and angers me and disappoints me, because instead we will allow things to happen in our church, and we'll say, well, boys will be boys. And we'll let things happen in our church that says, well, you need to dress more modestly. You asked for it. Or we'll say things in our church that goes along the lines of, well, someday you'll find the right person. All of those things have implications about who you are as a human and who you are when it comes to how you identify with sex and intimacy. Does any of that sound familiar? Like at all, you guys? Does anybody want to share anything? And I'm not talking about like a personal moment, but if you want to, you're welcome to. But I just want to make sure I'm not crazy here in that this is what the church does. Does anybody have any thoughts about this?
Last time I heard about this in church, I think I was 12. And it was a guys and they had like youth and.
Oh, they separated the groups?
Yeah. And
Oh, I'm so sorry. If you identify as female.
That would make me a lot uncomfortable.
Yeah. And you're going to have to find someone from within your own group to explain things to you. You no longer have access to me, the male, sitting at the front of the room. Yes.
It was just I remember it was really interesting. And everybody was kind of weirded out.
Yeah.
But it was like a whole event or something, with activities and so I think I blocked out a little bit. But I've
You blacked out, or?
blocked it out. Yeah. But I remember like all the guys screamed some kind of sexual term. It was very funny. That was the highlight.
That was the highlight.
Yeah.
Wow.
It the girls group and the other.
You guys yelled
Yeah,
something at the girls group.
Yeah, and it was like.
This sounds like it was a very effective and healthy.
It was really, I forgot all about it. Until
I
you
feel
mentioned
so
this.
unprepared now.
Yeah.
That seems so much better than
Given
what I.
the standard. But other than that, it's never been addressed. I just know that there's been different environments I've been in that have real strict ways of doing things and topics and so on. But those two were the only memories I have. They weren't that intense, so I figured I might as well throw it out there.
Yeah, please refrain from yelling any
Yeah.
sexual terms at people.
It wasn't like a rude thing. I think I don't
It was like a,
yeah.
okay.
We value you beyond your sexual.
Penis!
It's closer to that. I just don't know exactly.
I think probably my perception from like childhood even through my college ministry was the absolute purity was like the biggest, baddest sin you could break. And if it was broken, if we weren't getting it back kind of idea. And I think it was purity in terms of orientation as well as out of marriage, if you will.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I read a book on that. I forgot about that.
You
Yeah,
blocked that
no,
out too.
I asked her to read it just after we met. That was a huge deal. And like not kissing before you marry, all of that was really intense.
In my experience, it was more so aimed at the girls than the boys. Like, I mean, it was aimed at everybody, and very generally speaking, but there was this sort of like, well, you know, like you said earlier, boys will be boys, and it was also presented in a way that girls had to guard their purity, and it made, and in those terms, it made
I spell that wrong every time. Sorry.
and in those terms, it made men, or in our case, you know, teenage boys, seem like, you know, they were constantly on the prowl. And then adding to that, was always all the stuff about how you dress and things like that, which was weird because not only did it put the onus on the female, but also really made men seem helpless in a way. Because it was like, well, if you wear that, men will lose their minds and you can't control what they do, you know. So
So true, yeah.
I think insulting in that case to both genders.
A lot of this becomes goes from being systematic to legalistic very quickly, it seems.
Yeah, so I want to say that I think, now, don't get me wrong, I'm not defending this all out, but I want to give somewhat of a benefit of the doubt and say that a lot of this comes from good intentions.
Yeah.
Right? That there's a sense of good intentions that then becomes power, then becomes control, then becomes systematized, then becomes systemic. So, you know, I just think about what I grew up in, and this is pretty good. Did someone here, and if it was you and you do not want to share the story, you can just pretend like it wasn't you, and I don't remember well enough to know. But someone was telling me that they were part of a group and they were having a conversation about sex, and they passed a candy bar around. Anyone? So they passed the candy bar, and I know I'm going to tell the story wrong, and so if the person's here and they feel more comfortable as the story's going on, I want to share it, they can. But this is horrible, but I think this sums up this thing particularly. So they took a candy bar, and they passed it around, and they told the boys to take a bite of it. Then they gave the candy bar to the girls and said, girls, you're at this candy bar. And what boy is going to want a half-eaten candy bar? Okay, so excuse the French, it's not French. What the fuck is that? Right? What are we thinking? And what are we communicating to our young people? And how many of you, whether you were given the candy bar and it was passed around, how many of you, particularly the women in our community, how many of you were communicated that message? At least at some level.
There's also the chewing gum metaphor.
Oh, I haven't heard the chewing gum metaphor. I'm
Yeah.
so excited to hear it right now.
Yeah, Kelly's nodding, so, where it's like, basically, like, you can't unchew a piece of chewing gum, so ladies, you know, once you give it up, you're a used up piece of chewing gum, so you're therefore no good. And this was one of the things, does everybody remember Elizabeth Smart? She was abducted and raped, and how old was she?
I don't know.
Like, really young, and
16 or so.
something like that, and that was what she was taught. And so she had a really hard time getting, she's talked about this in different places, like she had a really hard time getting over that. She still felt like she was worthless, even though it was against her will. She still took on that, like,
Yeah.
I'm now used up.
What you're saying about the guy, like, I totally remember that. I think I blocked everything out. This is all surface.
I'm so glad that we can bring it back to the surface.
Yeah.
This is having the opposite effect is what I was hoping.
Especially in the realm I was, you get like accountability partners, and it's like you set up guys like they're bound to fail no matter what. That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
And I remember that. I was like, there's no way, there's no, like, it makes this like a huge.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and you're just like,
Yeah,
no
you're
pun
screwed.
intended, you're screwed. Yeah.
Well, so
Completely.
a lot of things, people build that off of the Matthew 5 section, right? Anybody know what the Matthew 5 section is I'm referring to? If you look upon a woman with lust,
Yeah.
you have committed
Oh,
adultery
yeah.
in your heart,
Very
right?
deep.
So I always, and I realize this is reductive, but I always say this is the yoga pants law that we teach in the church.
Yeah.
That if you even notice a person, that you are guilty of adultery. And so we've created this thing where we immediately make everyone adulterers. And we take young people and we teach them this. And let me just tell you that Matthew passage is taught so exquisitely wrong from what the text says. First of all, it's married woman. The Greek there is specific, unique. Norm, you are way more educated in this as I am. So if I say anything wrong, everyone here already knows that they have permission to correct me. You also, in fact, maybe more so, are welcome to correct me. But there's this implication within the Greek that it's referring to someone who is married. It's not a maiden, isn't the word that's used. It's a word used for someone who's married. So where else have we seen this verse with a wife? Jesus, I would argue, is quoting the Septuagint.
David.
No. I mean, implications, yes, but actually he's quoting a verse. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. The word that is translated as lust in the New Testament is the same word that's used in the 10 Commandments or the 10 words in the Septuagint for you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. That same word is used for your neighbor's field and animals. Do you see how this is a problem that we say lust? Because I don't know about you guys, and I don't know what Southwest Virginia is like, but I have never coveted in that term my neighbor's animals. I've never lusted after my neighbor's animals. I've never looked at a field and said, oh my, right? That covet, that word lust, that is intrinsically connected in our language, in our rhetoric today, to sexual thoughts or ideas. In the language, in the Septuagint, was used in the same way for referring to your neighbor's fields. So you shall not covet your neighbor's fields, right? Or their land or their property. this, I would hope, doesn't imply you shall not desire sexual intimacy with your neighbor's fields. So when Jesus says, you shall not covet, or if you covet a woman, if you covet a non-maiden, if you covet your neighbor's wife, it is as if you committed adultery in your heart. What do you think that means when we use the word covet as opposed to lust?
Can I ask a question that backs us up a little bit?
You totally can, because I was not very clear on this at all.
I'm curious about the translation and how we got to lust to begin with. Is it context specific? Was there something in the passage that made it seem like this was more like a sexual coveting versus a covet?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, again, we want to assume the best of everyone as we're wrestling with these types of things. I would imagine it was an intentionality of context. Like, in what way was Jesus speaking? The irony would be, is why they wouldn't recognize that it's all but a direct quote of the Ten Commandments and coveting your neighbor's wife. The only thing that's left out is neighbor, right? That's the only word. Other than that, it's a direct quote. And if you know anything about the way that ancient Jewish people quoted the text, they rarely quoted it verbatim. And oftentimes they leave things out intentionally to make a statement. All you have to do is read Paul. And when he's quoting the Hebrew Bible, and you go and look up the passages he's quoted, whether you look at the Masoretic text or you look at the Septuagint, he is manipulating the text. Not doing anything wrong, he's behaving very Jewish in the way that he's doing it. He's telling the story, he's reinterpreting, he's reimagining the text. So I don't know why we would miss that Jesus is quoting the Hebrew text. And also that context makes way more sense. One other piece might be that the word lust has evolved also. Not only is the language, but the word lust has evolved. And so I think maybe when this was translated or when it was first done, maybe the word, and I'm guessing here, maybe the word lust really was just synonymous with covet. And I can see how that would be. But today, our language has changed and we rarely would say, oh man, I lust after your car, right? Though if someone said that, you would know what they meant. So is that fair?
Yeah.
So I think it might be a combination of several things. And I think that there's a chance that there's an intentionality of leaving it in there and not, that is unfortunate. Because whether we like it or not, those who translate the text and interpret the text have traditions and agendas to match their tradition, whether it be the KJV or it be the ESV. Like the ESV comes from primarily, I think everyone who was part of the translation of the ESV come from very reformed theologies. And so there is going to be, when there's a decision needing to be made over a word, it's going to reflect the theologies that come out of the Reformed tradition, if that's possible. And I'm using the ESV Bible, and I don't personally identify completely within the Reformed tradition. So, any thoughts or questions about that? Norm, do you have any input? I would love.
Well, you can't help but think about the relationships, but for example, to covet is to want to own
Absolutely.
a person as land or a person. And it seems to me that that implies a lack of respect for her husband. You don't love your husband. I think the word love has to come into the picture. If you really love a person, you can see how delightfully sexual they might be. Femininity and all its beauty, but you respect that person because you have the long view in mind. You're looking ahead. What happens to her if you take over as if you're the owner? What does that make her feel like? 2 cents.
Yeah.
There's no love involved.
Right.
I think it's kind of interesting. My wife died few weeks ago,
I'm so sorry.
September 2nd. We've been married 69 years, and I've known her 10 years before that. And how I miss her, and how I miss the love that I knew was there, and was mine in a special way. And one of the wonderful things, now people who understand what the loss of a loved one is like will immediately, like, there are some girls and women in our neighborhood, one who is 8 months pregnant, and she immediately realized what hurt this would bring, and immediately gave me a big hug. I needed that.
Yeah.
But she wasn't trying to possess me. She was just trying to say,
yeah,
that's what you need.
Yep.
She knows that's what we all need.
Yep.
And without love, sex can be dirty.
Manipulative,
Yeah,
oppressive.
and it's not satisfying. The only really satisfying sex is one with love and respect. And it brings in what you talked about, justice,
Absolutely.
mercy.
Yeah.
And if someone has been violated by another's attack, you might say, or taking over unjustly, that doesn't necessarily affect the quality of that person, not at all. A girl who has been raped should not be considered unclean. That was somebody else who was responsible for that. She's
And it
still
would be
a woman.
unbiblical to apply that to the person.
But so it's complicated because we're very much sexual creatures.
Yep.
And made to pass it on to the next generation, I
Yes.
say.
Yeah.
And part of the creative process.
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for sharing, especially very personal and vulnerable things. The idea of this, when Jesus says that we should not covet another woman, I imagine that the way, because I base it on a lot of ways that some of the ancient rabbis read the Ten Commandments, in that if you coveted your neighbor's field, it wasn't just like, oh, darn, I wish I would have had that same luck. And it wasn't like, this is something that I wish I had access to. But it was, you had this sense of deserving. You had this mindset that it should have been yours, rightfully so. That which my neighbor has, I deserved. It was mine. It was owed to me. It is. And so when Jesus talks about this with the woman, right, he's talking about someone who imagines their life with someone else's spouse.
He's talking about the ego.
Yeah.
Our worst enemy.
Yeah, absolutely. He's saying like that you're like, if I were to participate in what Jesus is talking about, it would be that in some way I would disconnect from my own marriage and see somebody else and imagine what my life would have been, should have been, had my life been with that person. And I begin to live in this place of where my life would have been better. This would have been the more appropriate thing. And Jesus points out, rightfully so, that that's adulterous in your relationship. To spend your life in this fantastical place of moving in mentally with another spouse in order to get what you deserve in life, whether it's like, oh, it'd be so nice if I was married to that person. And it goes beyond that into this almost this place of like disassociation with your current situation and just living in a place, and eventually your ego and everything, I deserve it, your bravado, whatever it might be, eventually you'll become so disenfranchised with your relationship that it is adulterous. And I think that, I guess I don't want to get bogged down on what Jesus meant as much as I want to make sure that we talk about what he didn't mean. Right? I think it's way harder to do what Jesus was talking about. It wasn't something you accidentally walk into a coffee shop and do. Right? You don't accidentally walk into the midst of people and commit this crime of adultery in your heart. This is something that's way more prolonged, way more deep. And so I have heard it taught in churches. I have been taught through the church that any given moment, everybody lusts. Everybody lusts several times a day, blah, blah, blah. And so this idea of that we're all adulterous because of this statement from Jesus negatively impacts our ability to have healthy intimacy with the people around us. I'm not even just talking about spouses. I'm talking about healthy intimacy. Like like the church I grew up in, like a side hug was being a little risque, right? If you were of the opposite gender, right? That there is a sense of like, okay, never give a full frontal hug, like, right? And only do the side hug, and maybe don't even make contact with the hip, kind of lean in, right? Right? Did you have something?
Do you remember the church camp both of us went to?
Yeah.
I don't know
Dollar
if
bill rule.
I don't know if you had it, but we had a word, and it was always like a nonsense word at the beginning of each week, and it had to be short, and that's how long you could hug somebody.
Oh, no. No, ours was the dollar bill rule, and I just determined you could crumple up a dollar bill. Or you could turn it the other, you're supposed to say a dollar bill away from the person. And I was like, you turn it this way.
Just take it to your side.
Dollar bill thickness rule. But what ends up happening is that we create these pockets of just sheer guilt and shame. And we make everyone a threat. Whether it's ourself or whether it's the person we're about to side hug, right? We have pictures of this, I grew up in a church that, the idea was if two people that identify as different genders were to meet together privately, they need to leave a door open. What are you saying? What is being communicated in that moment? One, that I might be a rapist, or two, that the other person is a rapist or a seductress. Did you have something? No. That there's this communication that goes on of like that we just can't help ourselves, and it devalues the relationship down to only sex.
I think we have a lesson to learn from other cultures sometimes. You probably noticed that men in other cultures will often kiss each other on both sides of the cheek when they're complimenting. Or in Brazil, if a woman is married, she will give you a kiss on each cheek. But if she's not married, you get a third one on 1, 2, 3.
Nice.
And men always hug each other. They wouldn't think of shaking hands. That's
Right.
a business deal.
Right.
So they realized that we need affection.
Absolutely.
All of us need affection. We all need to know that we're loved.
Absolutely.
And love, when it's genuine, is not covetous.
Yep.
No, it doesn't want to possess. It wants to give.
Yep. I would say that the biggest thing that I was taught is affection is equal to sex, or at least leads to it. It's kind of like dancing leads to poker. Take that however you want. And so like that in some way that there's no such thing as just being affectionate to another person, that if you show affection, then you can be misunderstood. That's the other great one. Don't even give anyone the perception that there might be something wrong going on, right? And there's all this really great unhealth that makes us live in this perpetual guilt. And so when I talk about the idea that I want to talk about sex, I want to talk about the idea that it's beautiful, it's rich, it's good, it's something that we should celebrate, something as a church we shouldn't be afraid to talk about. However, what I really want us to get at is that intimacy and relationships and love, affection, those are all things that are so necessary for us. You know, we use the language all the time, fullness of life, right? That God has a desire through, whether it's his text or it's his faithful community, through Christ, through that he desires for us to have a fullness of life. We have, unfortunately, historically, in the church, removed much of the fullness of life by making us suspicious of the other in so many circumstances. And oftentimes it's tied to this, that we get to determine who you're allowed to love, who you're allowed to have intimacy with, who it is that you're able to be alone with even, who you're allowed to be seen talking to. All of these things, we have created these, the rabbis, we talk about this so much, call it a hedge around Torah. In order to protect the beauty or the sanctity of sex, we built all these hedges, right? And what did the rabbi say? That sometimes we can build a wall so tall that it collapses and destroys the very thing it was meant to protect. And I would argue that's what the church has done when it comes to sex, is that it's robbed a lot of us from having genuine intimacy with someone. It's robbed a lot of us from being able to show affection to anybody that we meet. It has taught a lot of us to live in perpetual guilt and shame and even bad views of ourselves. And none of these things, I would argue, are able to be anchored in any meaningful way in Scripture. We need to recognize that for us, intimacy, God uses that language all the time. That language is used a lot about that we must know God. And that word know is intimacy and sexual, right? That we must know God. There's this powerful thing about what that implies for us and what that means for us, how we engage one another, that there's intimacy that is at the very heartbeat of community, that affection and love is good and rich. I don't want my son to grow up afraid of sex. I want him to grow up excited about the possibilities. I want him to grow up thrilled with the notion of sexual intimacy, if that's what he desires, right? I don't want him to grow up with the shame and guilt that comes along with it. I also want him to know how powerful and how important and significant that is, and how rich it is. But instead, most of us have been taught it's all these things. It's about purity, and that your only value is your purity. Your only value is in how you dress. Your only value is whether or not boys will be boys. And if you're a boy, you're never called to something bigger and more important and significant than to be like, that's just Noah being Noah, as opposed to that you could actually be something more than just hormones. So, got 10 minutes. I don't feel like I necessarily wrapped everything up nice and neat. Not to use a condom analogy when I'm talking about sex. See, had to work that in somewhere, right? Okay. Any questions or thoughts about this? Or anything you want me to clarify? Anything you disagree with me on?
I was trying to come up with an example or something for some of the terminology. Like covet, you said it was more, possessive. I should have had this type thing. In the parable of the prodigal son, after he goes back, doesn't he have like siblings and they get the whatever split between all of them?
The inheritance.
Inheritance.
Yeah.
And I don't know the story well enough, but one of them, was he coveting the part that he should have had that went to the prodigal son? Is that in the story?
Yeah, I think you could make a case. I don't know if that's the point, but I think you could midrash that out of it. That because the older brother becomes angry because when the younger brother returns and gets accepted back into the family, that means he gets access to the inheritance again. So the inheritance that he blew the first time by being welcomed back and given a signet ring and being welcomed back into the fold of the family means that now the younger brother who just blew his inheritance is going to get a second portion. And the oldest brother always got 2 portions.
The oldest brother coveted.
Oh yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, so I think that's a great connection, Tony. I think you can make the case that we can see that played out there.
And another one that I was curious about, the Song of Solomon. What kind of picture does that paint in terms of this?
Yeah. The Song of Solomon is extremely sensual, and I would argue, though we like to make it about spouses, I don't think they were actually married. I think that, but that makes us really uncomfortable because we needed them to be married in order for that to be canonized in our mind, at least. And so I think it's a stretch to argue that that's about a married couple. But yeah, I think it's a good analogy. I think the celebration, there's nothing that's dreaded or angry or shameful or guilt-filled. In fact, they're a little too sharing with me, TMI, right? That there doesn't seem to be the same shame and guilt. In fact, I think the most important biblical story when it comes to shame and guilt and sex is what we see in Genesis 3, right? Naked and unashamed is what the text says. We eat from the tree prematurely, right? That gives us the ability to discern between good and evil. And the very first thing we discern, and we do it terribly, is that being naked is bad, and so we hide. And God is perplexed by this idea, right? God arrives on the scene and is like, where is everyone? What happened to this place? It was hopping just a couple of days ago. What's happening? And then he finds them and they're like, oh, we were naked and ashamed. And so we hid. I added ashamed there. That's not in the text. We were naked and we hid. And God's like, who told you? Oh, you ate from the tree. And now you're making bad judgments. You were not ready to be the judge. That's my role. And we see that the first time that we are demonstrated that we make a poor judgment was over sex, over nakedness, over mutuality. That's the first point in the text that we see that we are not on the same page when it comes to judging well and judging justly as God.
Another way of reading it is to say we wanted to be God.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, that's why God kicks him out, right? It says, now that you become more like us.
If you can't be thoroughly human,
Yeah.
That's what you are.
Agreed.
By the way, that's the crime that the church has when they declare Jesus as divine, as if he's different than we are.
Yeah.
Rather than being fully human,
Yeah.
we make him divine and therefore not really like us.
I certainly agree. When we forget the fully human part, it's not nearly as impressive that Jesus did what he did. Right? That's what I always tell people. Unless Jesus is fully human, what he did was not impressive. Because just being fully divine, well, of course he can do that. It's only the fully human part that makes Jesus' life story impressive. Kierkegaard agrees with me, so I agree with you. All right, couple minutes. Anybody else have any thoughts? clarifications? Cassie, did you have something?
I was just taking a deep breath.
Okay, fair enough. I apologize.
No, don't worry.
Does this make anyone feel a little bit better? Obviously, undoing years of work that may have been done on you through youth group could not be undone in the 55 minutes, not even that, because we spent time talking about other things. But I do want to offer this to each of you. If there's any of you in this room that this haunts you in your sleep or in your day, and that you have these lies playing in the back of your head and in the back of your heart, please make time to hang out with me and talk to me about it. Nobody should walk through life with this guilt and shame. This is not you. This is not biblical, and it is not fair that we have placed this upon you. And I just ask you to make sure that you seek out some time to sit down with me and we can talk more about this. I know that this is a really vulnerable thing, and so it can be complicated and difficult to sort through. But you really do not have to go through life with all that baggage. Okay? Anybody have anything? All right. Let me pray with you guys. Then we'll wrap up and do prayer requests and such. Lord, I'm so grateful for you. Lord, this topic is deeply intimate and deeply personal, and for many of us, deeply painful. I'm so sorry that we, as the church, have found ways to take something that you have given as beautiful and part of the creative process and manipulated it and bent it towards shame and guilt and oppression. Lord, I pray that we learn to walk with one another. We learn to care for one another and encourage each other in healthy thinking. Lord, I pray that if there's anyone in our community that is suffering from these unfair weights and all the things that are implied by that, Lord, that we find courage and means to care for them as a community, to show love, to show compassion, to show mercy, and to provide justice. Lord, I thank you for this group of friends. I thank you for this group of people to wrestle with faith and wrestle with what it means to be part of the faithful. May we become a body that truly feels the pain of our stubbed toe and tries to give it comfort. Lord, I love you, I praise you, I give you all the glory and the honor. It's in your most precious holy name